instructor, a professor for 30 years plus at Macalester College, and he also taught the Metro State. And I guess the rest, I'll leave it up to him to tell the story. Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. We're delighted to have you here. A little bit of logistics. So the restrooms are downstairs. There is an elevator if you need the elevator to get downstairs. And we have a guest book on the desk back there, and I want to strongly encourage you to sign the guest book, give us your email so that we can stay in touch, print so that we can read it, please. So we are a place, a project that is dedicated to telling the stories of immigration, telling the stories of working people, telling the stories of people who have been marginalized, pushed into the corners, left in the shadows. And we want people to come here and share their stories with each other. My primary partner in this project is my wife, who teaches theater, and she's really helped me and us to understand that theater and poetry and music and visual art are valuable and effective ways of telling stories. So we do a lot of work in culture. If you go to the restrooms, if you go downstairs, you'll see there is a mural painted in the stairway, painted by a Hmong artist who lives in this neighborhood. So we're trying to use art in many ways. We work directly with middle and high school students who do what are called History Day research projects. And we host all kinds of activities. We have 21,600 books now on the shelves, hopefully cataloged so that we can find them. And we've shelved the books by the collections that were donated to us so that you can see how a particular individual thought over a lifetime by the books that she or he collected. So we're an unusual library. And I hope to see more of you. I just learned that the Eritrean community has the church on the other side of Maryland at Greenbrier and Orange. I know the building because we were interested in that building before we learned that the city was going to move out of this building and made it possible for us to do this library. So we are neighbors. And I hope to see your children and grandchildren here and hope to see you here. One of the things that we've been doing is also hosting conversations among people from the Horn of Africa, particularly from Ethiopia, but also Eritrea and Somalia. We want people talking about how to create peace at home. How to build solidarity among people of different languages, different religions, but living in the same part of the world. So I hope that if you give us your email, we will be sending you only twice a month a newsletter by email about what goes on here, and you'll learn about when these conversations are taking place. Mostly people in the Oromo community have been the major promoters of these conversations. So, we met Petros, I believe, through the rhythmic literature folks, a group of largely Amharic poets, who will be here next Saturday, the 14th, with poetry. And we were just honored that Petros asked us if you could speak here. We're very, very glad to have you here. And I'm going to get out of the way so that Petros can introduce our special guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Before I actually introduce the ambassador, I just want to thank two people. One is Mohammed Ahmed. Where are you? Okay, right there. Mohammed Ahmed is an intern at University of Minnesota studying global studies. and he's the one who was helping me from the get-go and organizing the Horn of African community. Thank you, Mohammed. And the other is Ken Wanaku. I gave him a very short notice, but he was willing to come. Ken, but Ken is from Cameroon. He's particularly from Amazonia. Thank you. And Rhythmic Literature, which is an Ethiopian spoken word and poetry group. They're supposed to have this day, but when they hear that I'm bringing the ambassador here, they postponed their program for next week. So please start from here. Yes. Okay, now, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Petros, as you know, and I'm one of the co-hosts of Tempo Africa TV's Educator program. And it is a great honor to have the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Ambassador Andebrhan Welde Giorgis. Ambassador Andebrhan Welde Giorgis is President of Eri-Platform, an international civic society association working to promote dialogue on vital national, regional, and international issues impacting Eritrea and the Horn of Africa. Eri-Platform works to foster understanding of respect for and commitment to the rule of law, human rights, and democratic principles. Ambassador Andebrhan, educated at the University of Colorado and Harvard University, has extensive experience as a freedom fighter, educator, central banker, diplomat, negotiator, consultant, and political activist. He has taught economics management, African politics, diplomacy, and international negotiations. Ambassador Andebrhan is a founding member of the board, European Center for Electoral Support, senior expert, Global Studies, Global Governance Institute, brand ambassador, Wallonia, and senior research fellow at the Free University of Brussels. Ambassador Andebrhan is author of several studies, articles, and a book, Eritrea at a Crossroad, a treatise on self-determination, nation building, state construction, democratic governance, and sustainable development in Africa and Eritrea. Today's presentation topic is the Horn of Africa, Crisis and Prospect for Peace. Without further ado, I would like to invite the ambassador to the podium. Please join me in welcoming the ambassador.
Thank you, sir, for allowing us to be here this evening. Thank you, Petros, for your introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be here this evening to share with you my perspectives on the rather chronic state of instability, constant crisis, and also the prospects for stable peace in the Horn of Africa. My presentation will highlight first the salient features of the Horn of Africa, second, the current state of play in the states of the region, third, potential flashpoints in the region, fourth, Eritrea-Ethiopia reconciliation, a factor of stability, and fifth, prospects for regional cooperation and integration. If we look at the Horn of Africa, we have actually what we call the Horn of Africa proper, the one that is not coming. Okay. Next, please. Okay. The one in the pinkish red, this is the Horn of Africa proper. And if you add the green areas, that's the Greater Horn of Africa, which I think President Clinton coined during his tenure as President of the United States. You can see the population figures there, 0.97 million for Djibouti, 3.4 million for Eritrea, 112 million for Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia. Of course, you can see that in the slide. A total population of 282.2 million population. And if we look at the coastline, the Horn of Africa has a coastline on the Red Sea, course, if you include the Greater Horn of Africa, you start with Sudan. And if you talk about the Horn of Africa proper, you have Somalia with 3,333 kilometers of coastline along the Gulf of Aden and also the Western Indian Ocean. Eritrea, 2,250 kilometers of littoral and island coastline, and Djibouti, 340 kilometers of coastline. If you take the Global Peace Index, you can see for each country, the next, please. You can see where each country, the next one. Yeah, no, I will do that one, right, okay. You can see this, that in terms of the Global Peace Index, you see, if you start with Sudan, it stands 151 out of 163. South Sudan, 161 out of 163. Uganda, 105. Kenya, 119. Somalia, 158. Yemen, 160. Djibouti, 109. Ethiopia, 131. And Eritrea, 133. So they have, in terms of Global Peace Index, these are countries which literally suffer from the absence of stable, just peace in their domestic political life. If we look at the current state of play in the regions, or in the states of the region, we see that all of them are invariably weak and fragile states. You have Eritrea, which is in a state of political paralysis, economic ruin, and societal disruption. There is also a very precarious peace with Ethiopia, despite, of course, the fanfare that we all witnessed about a year and some months ago. And then we still have regional and international isolation, despite the formal lifting of sanctions, and I may perhaps clarify that, because Eritrea remains outside the international payment system, which is very crucial to the promotion of investment, the transfer of money for whatever transactions, whether for investment, for trade, etc., etc. So despite the formal lifting of sanctions, the Eritrea, or the state of Eritrea, remains outside the international payment system, and of course there is a reason for that. If we look at Ethiopia, we find a very unstable domestic situation and rampant inter-ethnic strife. You have also a very weak federal government that lacks real authority over its entire national territory. And then you have an unfinished peace with Eritrea and tensions with Egypt over the use of Nile waters. If we proceed to Somalia, we also find here a very weak federal government lacking authority over its entire national territory. Somalia is also home to various military missions from the neighborhood. So it has become, of course, a sphere of rivalry for hegemony, with Kenya in the south, Ethiopia in the center, even Djibouti, you have Burundi, you have Ugandan military missions there. And each, in its effort to foster an area of, or a sphere of influence, is actually augmenting the risk of fragmentation of Jubaland, Somaliland, and of course you have Puntland, you have different areas, and the fact that there are foreign armies from the neighboring countries and from two countries that are far afield does not augur well for Somali unity. And then you have Djibouti, you have a very precarious internal situation, and Djibouti, as we all know, is the home of military and naval bases of the major world powers. And if we look at the situation in the greater Horn of Africa, we see Kenya, of course, which is relatively stable and quite prosperous. Kenya is considered actually the regional economic powerhouse. Then if we go to South Sudan, we've seen that South Sudan has been racked by civil war and international conflict. All attempts at a peaceful resolution of the crisis have not succeeded. Even the 2018 revitalized agreement seems to be unraveling. You have the Sudan, of course. Recently we've witnessed heroic popular struggle that has generated a new transitional government. There are hopeful prospects, of course, but the new transitional government also faces serious challenge to building democratic governance. And then you have Uganda, which is relatively stable and prosperous, but again, very precarious internal situation in the run-up to the 2021 elections. In terms of institutions, you have two major institutions, one regional, the other, of course, Africa-wide. The Intergovernmental Authority on Development, or IGAD, is weak and ineffective as a forum for regional cooperation and integration. We have seen also at different times in its history being susceptible to instrumentalization by bigger member states. And you have the African Union, which essentially, really, if we don't want to be politically correct, and if you want to be honest, it's essentially a talk shop. It has a very poor track record defending or advancing the interests of the African people. Then potential flashpoints in the region. As I said earlier, we have very weak, fragile, and impoverished states with a history of wars and conflicts, large population displacements, and irregular migration. If we look at Eritrea and Ethiopia, of course, despite the recent rapprochement, the underlying issues of conflict remain unresolved. Viable resolution of the boundary issue remains pending. Ethiopia remains in violation of Eritrean sovereignty and territorial integrity, plus settlements that were put there in 2002, July 2002, remain in place. And no steps have been taken to institutionalize state-to-state relations. No preparations to provide for customs, immigration, trade arrangements along the border, because normalization would require mobility, movement of goods, services, people. But these these transactions must be rules-based, or else there's a risk of repeating past history. And then the Horn of Africa, of course, you have a very complicated conflict matrix. You have interstate conflicts that are still unresolved. Eritrea, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, Somalia. And you have intrastate conflicts, inter-ethnic, territorial, and boundary disputes. And then across the Horn of Africa, you have the Arabian Peninsula, which, of course, has, or developments where, or in which developments have spillover effects on the Horn of Africa. You have, of course, the Shia-Sunni divide, which has been there for about 1,400 years, and which has generated a Saudi-Iranian rivalry. You have the Yemen war as a manifestation of that. You have also major power projections, the proliferation of military and naval bases on both sides of the Red Sea, on the African side and the Arabian side. There is increasing competition for resources, for minerals, oil, natural gas, raw materials, ports, investment opportunities, etc. China has a growing presence in the Horn of Africa, with the largest military naval base already established in Djibouti. There is a growing Sino-American rivalry for these very resources that I mentioned earlier. And of course, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which many believe is the way to, of course, China, or increasing rise of China, and perhaps some would say the road to Chinese hegemony globally. And then you have large and growing youth population, mass youth unemployment. You have environmental degradation, there's climate change. The region, the various countries in the region experience irregular rain patterns. The rain sometimes come late, and when they come late, of course, sometimes they come in torrential forms, and they don't seep into the subsoil. There's drought, pests. Of course, we've been witnessing the invasion by locusts of large areas in the Horn of Africa. And all of that affects food and water security for the population in the region. You have, of course, air pollution, water pollution, and the pollution of land resources. On top of that, you have unsustainable exploitation of natural resources. And then you have also competition for water and grazing lands among different local communities, because the whole is characterized by two sorts of traditional lifestyles. Is sedentary farming in much of the world, particularly in the islands, and in the periphery and in most of the lowlands, they are nomadic and mostly grazing. So there is increasing competition for water and, of course, areas to graze. You have also regional conflict. You have this conflict between the upper versus the lower riparian states for Nile waters. There are, of course, historical colonial treaties, and some countries want to modify these treaties so there can be a more rational, a more just use of the waters of the Nile for electricity, for power generation, for irrigation, etc., for all kinds of development purposes. And then you have, of course, this competition also among neighboring nomadic communities. Add to that the interstate and interstate conflicts. And then you have this destabilizing impact of large population movements, displacements that are mostly internal. So when we look at the prospect for regional cooperation and integration, first what we need is the normalization of bilateral and multilateral relations among the countries in the Horn of Africa, which is really an essential condition for peace, security, and stability. And there can be no development without these three basic factors. Without peace, without security, without stability, no sustainable development is possible. And then you can have a possibility for the foundation for co-prosperity based on closer political cooperation and economic integration. This would provide, or this would avail large markets. As you can see, you have overlapping membership in several regional economic communities. The next one, please. Yeah. You have these countries belong to different regional economic communities, and overall you have, of course, the continental free trade area. If the artificial and natural barriers to the free flow of goods and services could be resolved in Africa, Africa could constitute a large internal market, providing for specialization on the basis of comparative advantage, which would also improve the efficiency in the utilization of the available scarce resources. And if you look at this, if you look at the, at the table, you will find that the proportion of the amount of trade that each country has within the region, very, very minimal. So this is the East African or intra-African trade statistics. And you can see that maybe Djibouti, because of the use of its port, then Uganda, and then of course Kenya. And on the lowest scale, you have Comoros, which are really very tiny islands in the Indian Ocean, and then come Eritrea with 0.7% of trade with the region, which is virtually nil. And then we see this region, you have 4.8 million barrels of oil passing through this region per day. Of course, at the strategic point of Bab el-Mandeb, which links the Red Sea with the Indian Ocean, but on the northern end through the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal links the Red Sea with the Mediterranean. So this is one of the most important routes for the flow of oil from the Middle East to the rest of the world. And of course, there are possible areas of cooperation. Tourism is one. Of course, there is unique biodiversity in the region. There's history, culture. There are pristine maritime and terrestrial environments. You can, for instance, envisage tourism, our tourists starting the Red Sea coast in the ancient port of Adulis, moving through Kwahaito, Matara, Yaha, all the way to Aksum, and then southwards to Lalibela, etc., etc. And then this is really an untapped potential that has been really kept on hold because of continuing disputes, wars, and conflicts. There's been no attempt to tap into the huge potential for ecotourism in the region. And then you have security, you have the proliferation of military base on both sides of the Red Sea Basin. And of course, if you have tourism, you can generate financial gain. You can also, through military cooperation or security cooperation, develop infrastructure which could have both military and civilian use. The risk is, of course, dependency, getting drawn into regional or international conflicts like what we've seen some countries in the region being drawn into the conflict in Yemen, sending military contingents to fight in a war that really doesn't benefit them or not in the interest of their own peoples. So, in general, what we can say is that the states and peoples of the Horn of Africa have more that bring them together than sets them apart or than separates them. Peace, stability, security, and cooperation are regionally indivisible. That is, no single country can enjoy these amenities alone without the rest of the region also enjoying the same amenities. These are really indivisible. And of course, these are also vital for economic development and prosperity. No country in the region can prosper alone. No country in the region can enjoy economic growth, economic development. I think they have a huge stake in developing together. As I said earlier, there is more that unites them than separates them. And they can build on the strategic interests, on a common future, to build an area characterized by political cooperation and economic integration rather than strife and conflict. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'll be very happy to go in detail about what I have said in very, very general and brief terms. Thank you very much.
We we will take about 5 minutes break and for the samosas and all the stuff. Then Ken Wanako will perform for 5 minutes. And thank you for Awad for being late. So in about 5 minutes we'll come back and we'll have a question and answer period for another half an hour to 45 minutes. Thank you.
That's why you came up. There's a lot of questions. Want to speak? What do you mean by you shouldn't only have this?
Just what the world is about.
3 to 8 tomorrow.
You know,
3 to 6 But you don't speak.
Chinese boy, crazy to see a world without silence. Send your ways for me. Say what you need. What you gonna do?
Maybe this one is not.
Oh, where to run? Time after time, we had a message in you. For nothing more. What you gonna do? Oh, no. What you gonna do? Oh, what you gonna do?
Thank you for hosting. Oh, my name is Grimo. Just call me Mr. G. Yes. Yeah. And what do you do here in the country? I'm originally from Ethiopia. I'm more involved in the local. I have a center out there. Yale University. You know, good size community center. Hello, Louis. Peter. Hello. How are you? Mr. Lewis. How are you? How you been? Very well. We met a couple times in South Minneapolis. Yeah, come here. Gurma. Yeah, I'm headed to Ethiopia and Eritrea soon. Oh, how soon is that? Wow. Are you serious? Absolutely. Oh, boy. We don't joke about this. Oh, watch out the conversations that might even talk over here. Specialist. Try to connect South Asia, South Native Indian. I've been to yeah, I have seen many. Semester thing like next week. Yeah, I'm gonna try. You're gonna come? I'm gonna try. They're always good.
Okay, እንመለስ ሞ ቦታ ናት። We're going to start, I know, I just remember. Okay, we can come back now for the question and answer period. Before that though, I really want to thank Ken Wanako. He performs every week at the Ice House, right?
Once in a while.
Once in a while? Yeah, okay.
But I played it tomorrow.
You play tomorrow at 11 o'clock, right? Ice House is on 25th and Nicolette. Thank you. Okay. Now we're back to the question and answer period. So please summarize your question in 1 minute. If you extend it, that's not a question, it's something else. You guys, do you mind? Come back. I know it. It's all these faults. Okay, we're starting the question and answer time, so if you have a question, please, confine it to a minute and make a direct question, then the ambassador is here to answer it. Okay, go ahead, it's open.
And they can come on the stage too, that would be better.
For the question?
Yeah, ask question.
Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah, that would be better.
Okay.
For the video,
Okay, no problem. All right, if you have a question, come to the stage and you can deliver it from there.
Oh, I thought
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
the professor.
Yeah,
Oh, he's just going to
he
be...
needs to be here at all
What was
times.
the mic? The mic's mobile?
Okay.
Is the
Hey.
mic mobile?
Malik, does that work?
No, it's different. It's different.
Yeah.
Is that for the singer?
Can you use it?
Yeah.
They can use it?
Okay, I don't want to bother people, but just for the video, I think if you guys can ask a question from here for us to be able to take it face, I think that would be excellent. Yeah,
Okay.
just leave it over there, yeah.
Okay, it is open. Who's brave enough to ask the first question?
Good evening, everyone.
Yeah. Close. Yeah, come close.
Oh, okay.
Hold on.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Alassane, and I have a question. Recently, the African Union launched the free trade agreement. So I'm wondering how this agreement is going to help the continent grow. So I would like to have your thought on that.
Thank you for the question. I think it's a very important question. In principle,
a free trade area, as I tried to imply in very brief terms, facilitates mobility, movement of goods, services, people, capital, etc. When we look at Africa, what are the constraints? First and foremost, you have infrastructure. When we talk about infrastructure, we mean in terms of transportation, communication, and power, water, etc. There are no roads or railroads linking East Africa with West Africa, North Africa with Southern Africa, via Central Africa, obviously. Okay? So there are barriers to the growth of trade among African states. When we saw the percentage of regional trade for every country, it's very minuscule except for Djibouti, which is largely because it's the main outlet for Ethiopia's foreign trade, import-export. That's what actually makes it quite significant. Okay? So this is one fact. Second, despite the African Union's commitment to demarcate all African borders, and of course that line has been moving because it's not been able to deliver on its promise, as on the basis of the long-standing African policy and practice, which is the sanctity of colonial borders inherited at independence. There are boundary disputes among several African countries, even where the boundaries are quite clear or quite clearly delimited. So conflicts, wars are also impediments to the realization of the African Free Trade Area. Many of these countries which have signed this free trade area have borders that are closed, borders with their neighbors that are closed. These borders need to open up. Instead of serving as walls, separating borderland populations, they should serve as bridges connecting these borderland populations, promoting cross-border trade, etc., etc., and of course trade between the countries. There are some countries that are strategically located, but because maybe of peculiar domestic policies, interstate conflicts are really lying idle. Some have even turned into ghost towns. So Africa, or the African Union, of course there are other issues. There are artificial barriers, customs. If you look at, you have several landlocked countries in Africa. Say Uganda, in the Horn of Africa, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi. They are serviced either via Mombasa or Dar es Salaam. How long does it take for goods, containers, to move from Nairobi, from Mombasa to Kampala, to Kigali, to Bujumbura? What obstacles do those who drive those trucks face on the way? Loss of corruption, loss of bureaucracy, loss, etc. So in addition to the lack of adequate infrastructure conducive to movement, you have also artificial barriers, some of which are political, others, of course, bureaucratic, etc., etc. So if Africa is to benefit from this arrangement, African states must seriously address these issues, resolve this constraint to the free flow of people, goods, services.
Good evening. I think I can talk. You know, my name is Groma. I'm originally from Ethiopia, in particular from Oromo community of Minnesota. I'm so happy to see you again. It's a great honor, and I really appreciate your discussion. I enjoyed it. I have quite a few questions, not a lot actually, as I thought, because you already answered here. Thank you. And the first question is, I was wondering how you can describe the Ethiopian and Eritrean reunion and how it has been going and where it's going now. And I was wondered if, when you were saying the boundary issue is not solved yet, I thought it has been solved. I didn't follow it really well, but I thought it has been solved, especially after the new prime minister came to power. Number two is, what do you know about the Ethiopian and Egypt relationship currently? Number three, what is the current situation you know, or what is going on in Ethiopia today? There are quite a few things going on, especially in the last 2 months. Most recently in the last 4 weeks. And do you think that they are preparing for the election? As a good scholar in the area, do you think that the election will be, you know, a way to go, or this election will not going on? Number four, and the last one is this. And having you in this kind of like a big area, I would prepare a better stage for you. There are so many East African people in this state, and so that you can educate everyone, not such small size of population. I'm not undermining you guys, but this is very important that he has been discussing, and it's so useful, especially for the users. Some of our users do not even know what we are talking about. We always saying so many things about our own, not about the whole region or the whole maybe ethnic. When I'm talking about Oromo, in Oromo there is so many diversities too. So it's very important that having you for different stage and educating especially the youth. We are going out of the line very soon, but we have to teach our kids the truth and only truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there are 4 questions. I'll try to remember them. I'll answer them in the order they were posed. First, Ethio-Eritrean relations. I think in July 2018, when the peace and friendship agreement was signed between the 2 leaders, I should say, for lack of a better term, there were high hopes, not only among the peoples of Eritrea and Ethiopia, but the region and indeed the international community at large. These were followed by considerable fanfare, Asmara, Addis Ababa, Hawassa, Gondar, etc. Reopening of the border crossings at 4 points, 2 in the central sector, 1 in the western sector, 1 in the southern sector. But we are now December 2019, about a year and a half on. Nothing has changed on the ground. The boundary issue, which is a cause of enormous bloodshed on both sides, considerable destruction of infrastructure, considerable displacement of the borderland populations, remains unresolved. In fact, untackled. Sayas has said that the border issue is not important. Abiy has said that they have not even raised or discussed the border issue. What then? So there was no movement. It's not that we are back on square one, but there was no movement out of square one. The border opening, the cross-border openings have been closed again. The Ethiopian army remains in occupation of sovereign Eritrean territory in violation of course, Eritrea's territorial integrity. Settlements that were established in July 2002 after the announcement of the finding by the Boundary Commission in April 2002 remain there despite repeated orders from the UN Security Council for the removal of these settlements. And these settlements are on Eritrean territory. Now, why isn't movement on the border? So the so-called rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea, for me, is a rapprochement between Isaias and Abiy. It doesn't go beyond that. Because there has been no change inside Eritrea. There was also hope that once this issue has been resolved, and the other issue with the sanctions, the UN sanctions were lifted, this would lead to opening up of the political and economic space in Eritrea. There would be no change. And so, I think we all understand when I said in Ethiopia I have a weak federal government that's not in real control, that does not exercise real authority over the entire territory of national territory of Ethiopia. We all know 70% of Ethiopia's military assets are in Tigray, and attempts to move parts of them have not succeeded. We all know the internal dynamics there. So that's where we are. Relations between two. There has been no attempt to institutionalize, to transform these relations into state-to-state. And you know, private relations between states, managing the affairs, between leaders, managing the affairs of state are untenable and susceptible to hiccups, problems, and perhaps conflicts of the kind we saw in 1998. So this is the first question. The second one, could you please remind me? Sorry.
Okay, the second one, the dispute between Ethiopia and Egypt on Nile issue.
I think there are the 1929 treaty, 1959 treaty, Egypt and Sudan, of course, with these treaties, provide Egypt with the lion's share of the Nile waters. I was tasked to look into this issue as a consultant by a major regional organization. And my recommendation was that the upper and lower riparian states come together to discuss how to have a fair and equitable share of Nile waters so that it can have, can use these waters to advance its development agenda. You know, if you look at the Aswan Dam, I'll be very brief because it's really a very long, complicated issue. A lot of water is lost in the Aswan Dam through evaporation. because it's in the desert. A win-win arrangement, in my view, can be worked out with the help of the international community, which would bring, of course, the United Nations, the European Union, and the G7, perhaps, World Bank, IMF, etc., to develop a water management scheme that would provide or that would allow for the storage of water in the upper riparian states and a constant, regular flow towards the lower riparian states, so that you can save a lot of water from evaporation. For instance, the Grand Renaissance Dam, an agreement to fill it up gradually without significantly affecting, because let's face it, the Nile is the lifeblood for Egypt. And any tampering, of course, we know the Egyptian position. Egypt's foreign policy is based on securing Nile waters and securing the Suez Canal. Because these are two of the major sources of finance for Egypt. So this is, for Egypt, of vital national interest. But the other states, there are, I think, 11 states of the Nile River Basin. So the idea is that an international framework can be worked out where the countries in the region can agree to build dams in the upper riparian states, which would guarantee a constant flow, agreed, I mean, win-win, because nobody has a monopoly. These are, the Nile is nature's gift to all the countries on its basin, and all countries have the right to use it. But they must use it in a way that benefits all and hurts none. So I think it's possible, given political will, given technical assistance from the international community, the upper riparian states can build dams, like the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia. Agree at the rate of filling, in how many years, how many per year, etc., etc., without interrupting the minimum requirement, the critical minimum requirement for Sudan and Egypt. And I think that's doable, given political will. And so you will have less loss of water, because there is less evaporation in the highlands, in the upper riparian states. And so you can save more water. And you can also, the Jonglei Canal, if you can build it, you can clear the swamps in South Sudan and increase the volume of water from the White Nile. So there are technical, there are certain measures that can be taken to increase the volume of available water for irrigation, while at the same time storing these waters in the upper riparian states, providing, of course, for the hydroelectric generation, for irrigation, and for drinking water, etc. So I think that there is a possibility of arriving at a win-win arrangement, but that requires political will and also willingness of the international community to support the project. And the third?
What do you think about the current Ethiopian situation and upcoming election?
It's really very difficult to have an authoritative explanation of the present situation in Ethiopia, because it's constantly changing. It's very fluid. What's happening today, tomorrow, something else happens. Nobody expected, for instance, the rift within Timlema. The elections, I think, you're probably privy to rumors that they're going to be postponed by 6 months. with all that implies. Because any postponement for that would also trigger certain actions that have been already threatened by certain actors. So I think in Ethiopia what you see is fragmentation of the political class, the elites. There is no consensus on where and how to move Ethiopia. So I think there is lack of a strategic perspective that commands consensus. I've been seeing the meetings in Addis, I'm sure you followed them. The meetings in Magale, I've been following them. So I think it's very difficult to say something very definitive about what's happening, because the reality is that this changes every day. What I can say is that Ethiopia was about 112 million, 110 million. It's the largest country, and the most important country in terms of population size and strategic importance, because it's in the heart of the Horn of Africa. Instability in Ethiopia would spill over, and its neighbors, all of them, are too weak and too fragile to absorb the shock. So we hope that the various political forces, the various political actors, stakeholders in Ethiopia would get their act together and agree on a peaceful, stable way forward. That's all I can say. I can discuss more in private if you like, but this is what I am prepared to say in public.
The fourth one is, are you ready to teach our youth, East African youth?
Really with pleasure. I'll be very happy to do that.
Tolmai, the next one, after her.
Oh, I should. I'm vertically challenged here. Okay. Thank you. My name is Gennet. I'm an Eritrean. My question to Ambassador Andebrhon is that I saw on the data says that Eritrean population is estimated at 3.4. You know, in Eritrea, it has not been done any census, and we know census are used for how to allocate resource, like building hospitals and schools. We haven't seen that in Eritrea. And how do they come up? What kind of data do they review to get to this estimation 3.4 population for Eritrea? Thank you.
That's a very challenging question. I'm privy to certain mechanisms, certain sort of, they're not quite official, but yet official. Some sort of census has been done, but the source of that is the UN, not any official census inside Eritrea. So I don't know how the UN arrived at its numbers, but the estimate, of course, in some UN statistics you can see as much as 5-6 million, which is really an exaggeration. That 3.4 seems to me a more realistic figure, and that's basically the population inside the country.
Good evening. My name is Louis Alamayu, and let's see. There's so much running through my head. I wish I had come here a lot earlier, and I don't know if that would have made it easier. I'm getting ready to go back to Ethiopia for, I think, the 5th or 6th time. I think since the early 70s, I've been a part of the Ethiopian, Eritrean community here. Just very lucky. But let's see, and the other thing, yeah, I'm pretty much a product of the Black Arts movement and the American Indian movement. And during the school year, I teach at the Higher Education Consortium for Urban Affairs. I'm community faculty for a course called Environmental Sustainability. So the question about the Nile really interests me. And in relationship to that issue, and also the whole issue of tribal identity. Last September, I spent some time with one of the elders at the Oromo Cultural Center, and one of the questions I asked him was, is there a way to tell history so that the people have a sense of their common roots? And he said there was, but I don't know of any book or schools that are actually teaching that. And I guess the second part, and I'll be quiet after I ask the second thing, it just seems to me that I'm having a hard time.
Say it freely.
I'm really concerned about, okay, this is the way I can get to it. We're 20 years into the 21st century, and I'm wondering from your perspective, are there 2 or 3 things that are lessons that we should be bringing into our world now that we should have learned because of what we experienced in the 20th century? Because I keep thinking, we use terms like development, and development the way we thought about it in the 20th century, it seems like it's no longer applicable. And I keep seeing how we have schools that are modeled after the Western world, and I don't think, how are we going to move forward if we're following a model that is not about who we are and how we need to live on the earth? Thank you for your patience.
You raise very difficult, in fact, very complex issues. Tribalism, ethnic identity, etc., etc. We have to look at the historical evolution of the nation state in Africa. In Africa suffered from slavery, from colonialism, and subsequently also from neocolonialism. You have structures in Africa which were developed in Europe but implanted on African soil without regard as to whether they are relevant or even applicable to the African situation. You can go back to the Pan-Africanist movement, which we all know started in the Caribbean, in the Afro-American communities, Marx, Garvey, Bois, and all that, okay? And then the independence movement, the national liberation movement in Africa. I think in the late 1950s, 1960s, there was a great debate among the African leaders who were divided between 3 groups, essentially. Had the Monrovia group,
had the Casablanca group, and they had also what's the capital of Congo, the Brazzaville group. Okay? The two most important groups were the Monrovia and the Casablanca group. In the debate, this is the future of Africa, and the relations among African states and African peoples, it was a view of the Monrovia group, the more conservative pro-Western group, that prevailed. The Casablanca group was basically Nkrumah, Modibo Keita, Bembella, Ben Mahdi, etc., etc. Gamal Abdel Nasser. So you had 7 countries against the rest. And I do not think that the debate there was purely indigenous or purely African. There were extraneous factors that influenced the outcome of that debate. I think on the eve of the proclamation of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa on May 23rd, 1963, Kwame Nkrumah made a very passionate speech, appeal, trying to say, okay, let's create the United States of Africa. And others said, no, this is not the time, we have to move gradually, etc. On account of that, so the vision of a union of African states and African economic communities, Abuja Declaration, all of that, basically remains in ink on paper, to be very frank with you. And Africa is still grappling with the legacy of the European colonial project. For instance, you have many African countries, if you look in the last, say, 50 years, post-1960s, when the independence movement began in earnest, you've had many wars, interstate wars, that are border-linked, border-related. Yet, the OAU position has been, of course, in the Charter, in the 1964 Cairo Summit, the resolution, 16.1, they proclaimed the sanctity of colonial borders and the gradual elimination of these borders, leading to the African Economic Community, the African Union, etc., etc. That's still work in progress. But even if that is the African policy and practice, hardly all states respect that. Even in areas where the borders are very clearly delimited by natural barriers, geometric coordinates, disputes have arisen. So we've had a struggle between, for instance, people seeking self-determination and countries trying to dominate others, like Eritrea, Ethiopia. Virtually, except for Liberia, the geopolitical configuration of African states, including Ethiopia, is an outcome of the European partition of Africa. And so either you agree to do away with the legacy of colonial borders, or once you're committed, you respect them. You cannot have your cake and eat it. So this is one of the problems in Africa. So I think there are diversities. The differences arise, for instance, in specific countries. I can take Ethiopia as an example, or any other country. You have different groups. You have different narratives of history. One group's heroes are other groups' villains. Okay? One group's liberators are other groups' oppressors. How do you harmonize these divergent narratives? And unfortunately, political elites operate to augment these divergences. in fact, exploit them for their own very parochial ends. And it's very difficult to construct a history of a particular African country which represents the perspectives of every constituent people of that country. Because they've had histories of wars, aggression, resistance, and all that. So I think the only way is, of course, to establish these states on the basis of a shared citizenship, where every citizen, irrespective of his ethnic background, regional background, language, gender, etc., will enjoy the same rights, the same liberties, the same opportunities for self-advancement. Only in that context can we build the solidarity and harmony that will enable us to transcend the legacy of the colonial era and move forward in a new future. And I think, as I tried to say, we have many, many more factors that unite us than separate us. And if we can focus on these factors, if we stop living in the past and build today for a common future tomorrow, I think we can overcome most of our problems.
Yeah, we can accept one more question. No, one more question. If not, thank you. Okay.
بتقريني ولا حق. President مالس Prime Minister ناي إثيوبيا هجي أبي أحمد مالتي كات مسد وصاب دين هنا هوني مقصر تزوح نجر نتي نحنا من النت زبل مالس بعالم درجة بطريقة خلاص فيرا مثلنا وصاب دين هاتو كوينه وكيل كوينه يدوي كنا مثل كانتي بزعبا بزحو علاتوين بزي ناي حزب إرترا بعلو يوعى على المزخمة مثل كان. Thank you.
Maybe for the benefit of those who do not understand the Greek, he's saying that Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is acting as the Foreign Minister of Eritrea, even going as far as entering into agreements with other powers on behalf of Eritrea. I think as Eritreans, we cannot and we should not blame Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. We should get our house in order, because he did not arrogate that mandate. He was publicly given that mandate in Asmara. Everybody had that. So why should we be criticizing Abiy Ahmed with the recipient? The culprit is the donor. And we know who gave him that mandate.
Petros, would you say something about tomorrow?
Sure. Okay. Tomorrow we'll have another program under the title of Rebuilding the Eritrean Economy. The ambassador will be here to discuss that issue too. It's not only for Eritreans, anybody is welcome, and the program will be in English, so everybody's invited. After that, we'll be going to Gabriel's restaurant after 6 o'clock. If you wanted to meet Andebrhon, Ambassador Andebrhon, we'll meet them there. But tomorrow's program is very important.
Start time? 3.
3,
right?
yeah, 3, yep, you got it.
Where?
3 to 6, here, right here. So we'll talk about a bit different subject that is related to the African issue as well.
Invite more people.
Yeah, invite more people, bring people more.
Please.
So,
Maybe I'll come for the dinner because I love food.
yeah, you're not part of the invited person. Yeah, so yeah, please do stop by tomorrow, but before we do that, we really appreciate Ambassador Andebrhon for the enlightenment on the issue of Horn of Africa, or Africa for that matter.
One question. In the answer. The number of audience here are so small for here, and there are so many people need to hear about truths of this region. So, is there any ways we can organize a stage for you so that you can come and talk about the region for the broader audience? Please.
In all fairness to the organizers of this event, small that it is, actually I did not come for this. I came for other business. I had other commitments in the US. I'm actually moving from the east all the way to the west, this is and then back. So I made a detour on the suggestion of Petros, and I said, fine. But I'll be very happy. Of course, I'll be very frank. We can organize one. I'm very happy to come and share my perspective with a much larger audience. We can have a much more interactive exchange. So I welcome the idea, and I'll be very happy to do it. Of course, I have, of course, constraints, but those constraints are not fixed in stone. We can work together to relax them.
Yeah, what I want to recommend is you and I can next time help, spread the word. But if only if we can get the news that you will be in town ahead of time. And sometimes people work, I invited a couple of people, but then they were working. So I think Petros can, this is like, there are many people, from all the region, Eritrean, Ethiopian, Kenyan, and West African. So I think we can do better than this. So next time, I think, Petros, you can do this instead of doing it by yourself to do, text only. I think it can be done better than this. I mean, it means that more people getting involved to get the word out.
I agree.
Actually, let me say this. You know the situation, you know the dynamics within the various communities here. I will go as far as saying, can select the topic, decide the time, of course, give me options whether or not, and that be the main task for which I come to North America. So it will not be an add-on thing, it will be the main thing.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.